Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast. I'm Philip Ideson, a 20-year procurement practitioner, former head of procurement, advisor to procurement leaders around the world, and the founder and managing director of Art of Procurement. My team and I work with our global network of subject matter experts to help companies elevate procurement's impact, whether that's through building and implementing transformation programs, sustainably reducing external expenses, or leveraging AOP Mastermind, our learning and development platform for companies of all sizes. You're listening to our flagship podcast, where we pull back the curtain and shine a light on the strategies, tactics, and tools that leading procurement teams are using to align their results with the needs of the business. Zero-based budgeting is a phrase that can elicit strong reactions from procurement professionals and from our stakeholders. In use as a cost management strategy since the 1970s, zero-based budgeting starts every internal budget at a zero base at the beginning of every budget period, regardless of how much money has previously been spent on any given line item. And the use of zero-based budgeting is expanding out of industries like consumer products, and its usage becomes more prevalent during times in which companies must quickly reduce their expenses. And so for today's podcast, I wanted to talk about zero-based budgeting. So I reached out to David Ward, and David is currently the Director of Global Sourcing and Procurement for a large pharma company. But I wanted to talk about a past experience when David was Programme Leader for zero-based budgeting within procurement at Unilever. And so he has first-hand experience on the impact of zero-based budgeting on procurement and the ways in which procurement professionals can mitigate some of the downsides of this approach, while taking advantage of the upsides. Now, we'll go into that conversation in a little while, but first of all, I just wanted to start the conversation by asking David, like I always do, if he found procurement or if procurement found him.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I was anticipating you would ask me it. I'm going to buck the trend of previous guests and say happenstance. It was a bit of both.
Yeah.
I found procurement and procurement found me. So my backstory, I studied business management at the University of Leeds in the UK. It was a very general curriculum, predominantly made up of core subjects such as marketing, finance, and also touched on subjects such as supply chain, logistics. So getting into that final year, and with an incredibly strong work ethic instilled by my family, and a fear for leaving my studies without a job, I did a great amount of effort in applying to lots of organizations to attend their assessment centers, the graduate assessment centers. So this was prior 9/11. This was 2000, 2001. So there was a lot of corporates still out there offering good graduate programs. And of the 20 that I applied to, I think most had a leaning towards marketing. If you'd have asked me what I wanted to do, I would have told you I wanted to pursue a career in marketing. If you had pushed me, I don't think I could have given you a reasonable answer as to what specifically attracted me about marketing. But I was fairly agnostic. I was more compelled to find a job. So I applied to supply chain assessment centers, logistics, and even some sales positions. And I was actually more guided by the types of companies that I wanted to work for. And I think that's been a consistent throughout my career. It's been really the company, the brand, the reputation, the industry, which has attracted me most. And that company that gave me my first shot was Ford Motor Company. And obviously, we both know Ford well. We started off our procurement careers there together. So cut to attending a 2-day assessment center, I had my eyes opened. They did quite the sales job on me. Learning about the way in which procurement was not only an integral part of the business, but the value proposition, the opportunity, the possibilities, the way it connected different functions with each other. It just seemed incredible. And Ford, certainly at that time, and automotive in general, was still a very attractive and incredibly exciting place to be. So I was sold, and I was one of the few. I think there was an intake of 10 on the procurement and supply chain program that Ford was offering. I was one of 10 lucky individuals from thousands. And I think in retrospect, whether I knew it at the time, there was really two key features or two key elements to joining Ford, and which made Ford such a great employer for me. One was the family spirit. So you and I both went through the graduate program there, albeit at slightly different times. But if I look at our graduate community and the extended community, it really fostered a family spirit. And it was made up of some pretty incredible people. We've all gone off to do different things across procurement and supply chain, and people like yourself doing some really interesting stuff. But it was a great time to be in the company. I think coming out of university, it kind of gave me that family support and a great environment to learn in. And which leads me to the second point. I think retrospectively, very few companies, certainly outside of automotive, were doing procurement to such level of sophistication and complexity. We really did learn from the best. I mean, I know things have changed, and I know the whole automotive environment has changed, but I'm incredibly grateful to Ford for giving me that foundation in procurement, giving me that learning, and essentially giving me my foundation to what's become almost a 20-year-long career in procurement.
Yeah, what was really interesting being part of that scheme was, like you, I didn't really know that much about procurement when I came in, and then you kind of sold because you realize in a company like Ford, you truly are at the center of the organization, connecting all the different bits of the company together. So you're really at the heart of things, and you also see the results, the impact of what you're working on, every single day as you see all these vehicles driving down the street. And I think that really had a big impression on me. But honestly, the big thing for me that you just mentioned there, and I didn't realize this until I left, was how advanced some of the things were that we were doing. Because I think like in any organization, perhaps you get to a point where you think, maybe we could do that better, or maybe we could do that better. And you get this little bit of, well, the grass is greener somewhere else. And, I left the auto industry really just because I wanted different industry experience, but I wasn't prepared for how advanced some of the things that we were doing 20 years ago, from a category strategy perspective, as an example. When you look at supplier collaboration and value engineering and just things like that even today, here we are 20 years later, a number of organizations still aren't necessarily at that level, which really surprises me in one regard. But yeah, that was certainly a big takeaway for me as well from those days. So what I do want to talk, David, about today is, now, the question I ask myself is whether I call it ZBB or ZBB. First of all, I'll go with zero-based budgeting. And then I think I'm going to try and stay true to my British heritage and call it ZBB. But something that is, I think there's going to be a lot of companies who are facing ZBB initiatives, obviously because of all the changes around us right now. And it's something that I know that you've got a lot of experience in. So I want to kind of tap into your experience in ZBB in a couple of areas. One, we'll talk about when it's a top-down approach, but two, what we can do as procurement professionals to kind of think about using some of the principles of ZBB, but applying them to a category, our own individual categories. And I'm going to start just by asking if you could just kind of set the context a little and share more about what ZBB actually is.
Yeah, so Bill, when we were first in contact and we were talking about my coming on to out of procurement and sharing my experience of ZBB, I was met with two emotions. Firstly, excitement, and then secondly, somewhat reluctant,
Yep.
not just because I don't like listening to the sound of my own voice, it makes me cringe, but rather my experience, as you pointed out, it's somewhat limited to leading Unilever's ZBB program. And there's two Brits speaking to one another. I'm going to go with ZBB. I apologize.
I'm going to try my best.
Our American listenership. But, Unilever is an interesting company. So perhaps my experience makes for a good case study. But I do recognize that there'll be far more experienced ZBB practitioners listening in. And I don't claim to be an expert. And as I was at pains to state, I'm certainly not a ZBB zealot. It's interesting what you said on a corporate level, how ZBB is rolled out and applied within organizations versus a functional level. So, being very transparent, and on a personal level, I struggled with the degree to which ZBB was implemented and subsequently impacted my own procurement organization. For instance, I felt some of what ZBB set out to do related to category management was actually counterintuitive, and which to some extent tainted my experience. I do see its value and potential, but I also a strong believer in there is no one-size-fits-all blueprint, but rather a clear, aligned purpose and appropriate application. And I really have to highlight that an appropriate application for the company, for the organizational culture is the key to success. And I guess that's what we'll get into. And, maybe, again, I expect that there's going to be a varied audience. There'll be a mixture of seasoned ZBB practitioners. There will be individuals who are part of organizations who are either considering it or about to implement ZBB. And then there'll be those folks out there that really know not much about ZBB and are just curious. So pardon the pun, we might be better off just to have a bit of a baseline. What is ZBB? And then I can give you a bit of context about my own experience.
No, I think that'd be great, especially for those who aren't necessarily as well versed in ZBB. Is kind of what's the goals? Like, why does a company look at implementing ZBB in the first place? What outcomes is it trying to drive? And then we can perhaps talk about some of your personal experiences and what that means for procurement.
Sure, absolutely. And I think that's a great place to start. The ZBB, as we know, and I'm sure most of the folks out there have heard of it, if they're not already doing it, and it's somewhat infamous. So maybe the best place to start is saying what ZBB is not. And ZBB is not a cost reduction tool or a weapon to beat suppliers with. Rather, it's a framework by which companies approach every budgeting period as if from scratch, completely removed from past results. So unlike traditional budgeting methods, which we're familiar with, which use past allocations as a benchmark for adjustment, ZBB forces leaders and managers to scrutinize and justify individual costs, but also to understand the business key drivers and develop an analytical and participative planning process. So you develop budgets from the bottom up. And again, that's very in keeping with our automotive background. So I know that's something that you, and I'm sure many of the folks out there with similar backgrounds will be very pleased to hear. Every year's budget under the ZBB principles is determined not by what is currently being done, but rather by the needs and objectives of the company in the year ahead. ZBB can be applied holistically at the corporate level, at the enterprise and or functional levels, or specifically on one element of the business. And again, I think we'll talk to my experience and maybe how we can get the most out of ZBB in the future. Essentially, in its most basic form, ZBB is a business driver-based modeling and planning process. So cost reduction, or more appropriately for our audience, cost management, is a benefit derived from employing ZBB. It is not a cost reduction tool.
Right.
So that, it can be contentious. It is perceived as divisive, particularly by those procurement professionals who spent decades on our strategic value proposition and earning our seat at the table. It's nothing new. Since its inception in the 70s, but particularly at times of crisis, and we're in one right now. Sorry to date the podcast, but obviously we're sitting in times of COVID. But certainly since the 2008 financial crisis, ZBB has been broadly applied across industry sectors. It's really come back into its own again. And there are some real horror stories out there. Everything from a super aggressive approach to cost savings, job losses, restrictions on being able to hire, to retain, to develop talent, through to travel restrictions, travel bans. I mean, we've all heard of the stories about having to share hotel rooms, and being really transparent, Phil, that was my experience.
Yeah.
The one event at Unilever that I attended in 2017 was a global summit for indirect procurement, and that was a room share basis. Yeah. I was one of the fortunate people. I got to share with a close colleague and a good friend. I mean, he might say otherwise, but ZBB, quite rightly so, really divides and polarizes opinion.
Yeah. Now, how involved did you see procurement being in the budgeting process? So was your experience as procurement being okay, this is now the new budget, go and execute and deliver against it? Or did you find that procurement stakeholders even were involved heavily in building that budget, so it was more of a team effort to then go and deliver against it?
Yeah, so pre zero-based budgeting, and keeping in mind the context, Unilever certainly at the time had built up a highly mature, high-performance indirect procurement service offering to the business. And I was one of those global category leaders. At the time, I was managing professional services and business process outsourcing. So I and my group were supporting a wide, diverse range of stakeholders, and I can honestly say we were not a participant or a contributor to setting that annual budget. We may be requested to provide information, benchmarking data, supplier spend, category, subcategory spend, the usual. And I would say that was, having experience of other organizations, that's still fairly advanced in procurement level of engagement of procurement. But no, we were not in the room. We were not part of that process.
So then when budgets are set, how did that then trickle down to you? Was that, stakeholders now seeing what the new budgets were and seeing procurement as a partner in helping deliver against that? Or did you find that there was a lot of angst at the process from those budget owners who then, and procurement was kind of pushed on them as the tool to help them, reimagine their spending in line with their new budget every year?
I think it was a bit of both. Again, before I moved into my role as the BB lead, and back into my role as global category lead for professional services, if I look across the groups, the finance team, part of treasury, overlooking treasury and tax, etc., were pretty well structured. Yeah. If I look at business advisory, consulting, not quite so structured, because by definition, the people, the requesters, the business owners didn't necessarily know that they had a requirement until 3 or less months out. Yeah. So,
the more
that's the nature of the beast.
Expenditure rather than proactively planned.
Precisely. So if I look at those two ends of the spectrum, no, procurement really wasn't participative in the budgeting process. And when you say angst and, I guess, level of involvement and effort for those functional leaders to create their budgets, again, we procurement didn't have much visibility of that. We understood it was a stressful time. We were occasionally asked the questions or requested information to provide into that budgeting process, but we were just simply not part of it. Now, again, depending on which subcategory and subsequently stakeholder group, we will be used in different ways. Now, if I look at, and this was really where my ZBB and category experience interlinked, and then I moved into ZBB. Something that I was immensely proud of was partnering with the chief legal officer. My procurement group and I were supporting the chief legal officer to transform the way in which legal services were procured, were sourced globally. It was an incredible opportunity, and I still look at it as a career highlight. For years, myself included, procurement had knocked on the door of legal to try and get some traction, but always failed. It was really just kind of one directional conversation and dialogue, and the legal group really didn't see the value in procurement. The new chief procurement officer, a lady called Ripa Satama, previously from GE, came with a vision to completely transform the way in which legal services were sourced globally, and also transform the in-house legal service offering. I think, and apologies to any lawyers listening on the call, but I think sometimes the legal organization forget that they're providing a service to the business too. But certainly in Ritva's case, and to many of the of my former stakeholders, that's not the case in Unilever, and they were really keen to change the way in which it worked and partnered with the business. So to summarize, Ritva wanted to reimagine the way in which the in-house team was supporting, primarily on, as you would expect, core activities, and either deprioritize or send externally non-core activities. So my job as the procurement business partner was then to work with them to firstly at the global level, put in place a preferred supply list, some very basic sourcing elements, but we use legal terminology, a panel of law firms to handle large corporate matters, and then to deploy the same blueprints in the regions and key markets. I can't even begin to tell you the amount of value that drove within the business, not to mention cost saving. But that was one element of the transformational journey. The issue that I had, and this is where I have a bit of a personal negative experience of ZBB, in part of the design and then deployment stage of ZBB, of which I was supporting, an assessment was performed across each of the categories. I mean, this is standard ZBB practice. And as it got to my group's categories, professional services, and therein legal, it was considered that legal was actually being sourced and managed optimally. In fact, it was benchmarked as upper quartile. Now, I take that as a great compliment. That's fantastic to hear that one of my subcategories, categories has been ranked by an external advisory firm as above upper quartile. That was wonderful news. But what that translated into and manifested itself into was actually procurement done as much as it needs to do in this area. And actually, from an FTE model, going to remove that FTE or that group of FTEs and put them onto something else. And in actual fact, what happened was procurement lost those FTEs. So in my opinion, there was still a lot to do in the legal space. And I felt personally that I hadn't delivered, on behalf of my group, we hadn't delivered on Ritva's vision. So I was disappointed. I also look at the partnership, the role in which procurement plays as a business partner, not just in the sourcing and contracting process, but the ongoing governance. So, taking work out from the in-house legal team and moving it to the external firms is a fantastic idea. But who is managing from a contractual and commercial perspective? Who is managing those relationships? Because by its nature, you're handing over some very significant, by its nature, you're handing over some very important, very critical activities and putting it out there into the supply base. Now, with procurement gone, because it was considered to be already, legal services was already considered to be performing optimally and above quartile, you know as well as I do, Phil, and many of the people listening to this, you can lose the true value, not just savings, you can lose the true value of a sourcing engagement and a supplier engagement through poor governance. And I mean, to some extent that happened, you know, poor discipline between Unilever and the external firms not submitting accurate fees. You know, procurement is that kind of, quite often that facilitator or the mediator when there are commercial commercial disputes. So by disappearing and then only coming back in, say, 1 or 2 years at the onset of sourcing activities, so when those contracts were at a point within the life cycle that it required procurement to come back and run some RFPs, personally, I feel that procurement's role became quite reductive, and it was counterintuitive to all of the hard work both procurement and legal had done together. So I was really disappointed to see that I understand that the principles of ZBB don't necessarily meet each and every category the way we'd like it to meet it.
So you and I both got experience in a lot of outsourcing, BPO, KPO, call centers, you name it. And, you know, a lot of those engagements are long-term. They can be multi-tower, 5-7 year deals. You know, I think about those and I'm not sure if they lend themselves well to ZBB principles. And so I guess my question is, you know, when you look across different categories, are there certain categories of spend that lend themselves better to managing within a ZBB framework versus others? And then I guess the follow-up is those that don't, are there other things that we can do to get a little bit creative?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. And I'm sure some of the folks out there who are seasoned practitioners of ZBB will be able to do a better job of answering this. But for sure, you raise a good question, but also highlight one of the shorts, of which there are many, of ZBB. So, you know, just playing back some of what you said, for sure, ZBB, I think, does lend itself better to some categories than others. So let's pick on marketing, my favorite function to pick on. By nature of a brand, there will be various activities taking place in the year ahead. So there'll be relaunches or launches of new products. There'll be innovation taking place. And I think we go back to the key principles of ZBB. It's a tool to plan more accurately, to improve the discipline around planning. There's certainly value there. And because of those activities taking place within a short space of time or within a 12-month period, you know, it lends itself well to RFPing and being agile enough to adapt ZB principles too. However, if we look at you know, fixed-term, long-term outsourcing agreements, let's pick on one of our favorites. We both have experience of, as you say, HR services. You know, they can be, a big HRO can be anywhere between 5, 7, up to 9 years. Now, you know, ZBB, in principle, or my view at least, is that there still is some relevance. So, for instance, looking at innovation taking place in the IT community, as you get better at planning what the IT community has in front of it and what they're looking to prioritize as which underpins the key business drivers, they could be solutioning an in-house application development team. That's something my current employer is doing right now. So are they building competencies and capabilities which could say, put against HR, they could take away the first line HR services. So they're moving to automation, for instance. Is there an opportunity to take that away from whoever's got the HRO, Genpact, Accenture, whoever that looks like, but to take that element away? So you could be saying to your peer in stakeholder community in HR or your procurement peer in HR services and saying, look, I'm aware that this is happening in IT and there could be future capability. This is something as a variable you might want to negotiate into the contract, because 5-7+ years is an incredibly long period of time. And if we look at the big BPO providers, look at their footprints and their in the likes of Bangalore between Accenture and IBM and what they're looking at doing over the next 3 to 5 years in terms of moving to automation, that footprint, an FTE footprint, is going to look very different. And is your contract, which covers the next 7 years out, does that reflect what that footprint may look like? Are you paying for like? Does the cost and the fee structure that you're paying resemble reality? Or are you just going to take that on the chin? So, you can, by having greater visibility, and I keep picking on IT, but across HR and all of the other functions, you can plan what those activities are or have the visibility of those planned activities and determine how that could potentially benefit your longer term agreements. Also, coming at it from an in-house resource perspective, BPO deals, HR, again, HRO, that requires a lot of resource to manage in and of itself. So, you can take a view on a budgeted annual basis. What is the activity taking place as it relates to that HRO and the services being provided to the business, to the enterprise from that HRO, and is it adequately resourced? So is the performance of that supplier, is it dipping? Are we getting a lot of noise back from the organization? Do we need to put improvement measures in place? And if so, do we have the right level of resourcing to support that, or do we have the right capabilities to support that? Now, that might come from diverting resource internally, or it could come through as acceptance that needs some external support. So ZBB can, if applied even to those long-term engagements with suppliers, there's certainly benefit there for sure. Yeah, but I think it's just how you apply it.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it brings discipline in terms of when you're looking at contracting to build as much flexibility into that contract as possible, because things are going to change. And the world, as you said, may look a very different place in 12 months or 24 months than it does today. And it's sometimes easy to get into those longer term deals where you end up with these fixed commitments that last the length of the deal, where you can't get out of it. So that's definitely one thing that I would say is, an opportunity for us to use ZBB as well as kind of one of the, it's almost like the stick to make sure that you get that flexibility into your contracts. But I actually wanted, as we start to wrap up, I wanted to switch a little bit. We've talked about ZBB from a top-down approach and how we can help our organizations respond to that, while making sure that we're not, as much as we can, not using it just as a stick to beat up suppliers, as a cost reduction tool. As you've said many times, that's really not what ZBB is about, but it can be, if we're not careful, something it becomes. A lot of the principles we talked about are still, I think, important or opportunities for us when we're looking more proactively. So we're not in an organization that has a ZBB initiative, but we're looking at a category level of ways to how can we help better manage expenses within a category. Now, other things that we can take from ZBB that we can apply more generally to category management and the development of category strategies.
And you raise a great question there, Phil. And in my own opinion, this is really where, and for most of us listening in on this call, I think this is how we get started on ZBB. In fact, I right from the start of our conversation, I was at pains to state I'm not an advocate for ZBB, or certainly not for its broad brush lift and shift approach. I think ZBB needs to be applied appropriately for the context, for the culture of the organization, and for the purpose. Now, one way of doing this is trialing it, piloting ZBB in a section or segment of the business. Now, that could be a category, as you say. So let's take, off the top of my head, two categories, or two areas in the business that are prime examples and lend themselves very well to this type of pilot, which would be research and development and IT. So those two functions essentially are the lifeblood of the organization. Certainly as it relates to R&D, that's your pipeline.
Yeah.
It speaks to innovation, it speaks to growth. And if you're not already, you should be carefully planning what are the initiatives, work streams, or projects taking place in R&D. And you should be able to base a resource model around that. Now, I'm sure in most organizations, or those organizations that do have an R&D function, there is a process for doing that. But lifting some of the principles around ZBB, I think there's significant benefit doing that with R&D. Because let's look at, I think I made the comment before, where you have multiple projects and multiple new products, for instance, coming through the R&D pipeline. That's great, but what product or what initiative really delivers against the key business priorities? What delivers against the key drivers? So it could be around sustainability, it could be around digitalization.
Mm-hmm.
What are the imperatives, and how do those products stack up against it? How do those initiatives stack up against it? And again, under ZBB principles, it's not all work streams are created equally, nor should they be. So you should be funding them appropriately, rather than having a parity of funding and nothing really progressing. What could be the exponential value behind ensuring that one product which delivers against digital security, or right now in the COVID crisis, secure video conferencing platforms. If you were to fund that appropriately and put the right level of resource on it, you could bring it through within the next couple of months, or maybe even less. But if it continues to be funded in a similar way to another product or another work stream, you might never get there, or certainly it will be, it's going to be 6 months, right, 7 or 8 months down the road when the crisis looks very different. Mm-hmm. And you had a chance to respond. And again, that's the beauty of ZBB. Back to kind of my opening spiel, I guess, and my summary of ZBB. It gives senior leadership the visibility of what are the key initiatives, what are the projects, work streams that really deliver against the key business drivers. And it allows them to take a subjective view to decide what is core versus non-core, what could be potentially divested even and hived off from and separated from the business, or what could be deprioritized and defunded, and channel that funding into the right work stream or activity, which is really going to deliver against the key priorities of the business. And again, let's look at our friends in marketing. I said I keep picking on marketing, but Unilever was spending in or around the region of about 8 billion euros on marketing annually. In I think it was 2017, in my final year at Unilever. Just applying a ZBB principle, so getting the marketeers who probably will be very reluctant, very resistant to take on ZBB. Let's be honest, it's not just procurement that may be hesitant or challenge ZBB. For marketeers who were very powerful individuals, very powerful groups within that business, they may feel that it's a loss of power, a loss of control. But by bringing them into the ZBB concept, you're actually giving them an opportunity to pitch for their business, to champion their business. Now, what marketeer worth his or her salt wouldn't want the opportunity to pitch for their business? But in doing so, they need to adequately, appropriately plan their activities in the year ahead, pull together from the bottom up a resource plan and all likely expenditure associated with their activities in that year. And if they do a good job of that, and if they're working on a brand or an activity which delivers against a key priority, well, they might not just gain their last year's budget plus 1 or 2%. They may get an exponential increase in their budget to expedite that, to bring that along.
Yeah.
And we as procurement have an integral role to play in that. So, many of us are already partnering with marketing to co-lead and co-create strategy. And, to some extent, more often than not, the marketeers will lead the strategy and then we'll business partner with them. And there's nothing wrong in that. But if we can apply, as the gatekeepers, the governance and the discipline to adequately plan things, imagine on an annual basis, you have an opportunity to reset the conversations with the WPPs of this world. Mm-hmm. The enormous conglomerates that probably take up 85% of total marketing spend, who have become probably quite complacent by this time. So let's take some rough numbers. Say 5 billion euros of spend is with one or two large marketing services conglomerates. Well, just by explaining to them that your organization is adapting to ZBB methodologies and principles, and that in response to having to internally pitch for budget, your expectation as a marketeer or as a marketing procurement lead is that in turn those conglomerates will have to pitch for the business too. Wow, you're going to really get them to pay attention and to take notice. And I think we see it on large outsourcing projects and engagements, but the same really in marketing services. You'll go from having the B, C, properly Z team to having the A team back in the room again, and you'll be seeing some really interesting things from those agencies.
Well, David, I know it's about time for us to wrap up, so I want to thank you so much for your perspectives and experiences as it comes to ZBB. I think it's going to be something that is ever more important. More organizations are going to be embracing it right now. So how we do that, how we can support it and do it in a way that still protects our suppliers is going to be really key. But also, I'm a really big proponent of using some of those principles proactively in ways that we can build kind of category strategies from the ground up and helping our stakeholders to do that. So you're getting the benefits of ZBB, but without necessarily the corporate pressures of the way that you should be going about doing it. So I want to thank you. Last question that I always have is, if people would like to reach out and connect with you, where would be the best place for them to find you?
Yeah, well, thank you, Phil, for inviting me to contribute to the Art of Procurement podcast. It's been a pleasure and a privilege. Folks are more than welcome to reach out to me via the usual means. I'm on LinkedIn, David Ward, or they can drop me an email at davidjamesward, all one word, at icloud.com.
Perfect. All right, David, what I'm going to do is I'll include the link to your LinkedIn profile in our show notes today. And those show notes are just going to be at artofprocurement.com/podcast. That's where we have all of our podcasts published. That's artofprocurement.com/podcast. David, one last time, I want to just thank you again so much for joining me today. I want to thank you for listening in to my conversation today with David. The big takeaway that I want to highlight is that while zero-based budgeting has both its advantages and disadvantages for procurement, it does provide an opportunity to build agility and optionality into our supplier relationships. However, this move towards shorter and more flexible contracts does mean that we have to place an increased focus on supplier relationship management for our most important supplier partners. Now, to subscribe to our weekly newsletter, the AOP Insider, and never miss an episode of the podcast, go to artofprocurement.com/subscribe, and you can find a back catalogue of over 300 podcasts from the past 5 years at artofprocurement.com/podcast.